Rob Bertholf here in the fourth video on the one-year anniversary since the main thrust of the genocide in Gaza, and we're now witnessing the expansion that we had predicted previously. When we start looking at, again, the video series, we walked really through this idea of empathizing with, with their perspective, but then seeing the dangers of that and ultimately seeing the results that we found from that. And I think that it really struck me just a few days ago in the most recent vice presidential candidate where Waltz mentioned that the expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity to the U.S. to have steady leadership there. While it might have sounded like a Freudian slip, because I think he was confusing Israel with Iran, it really revealed a deeper truth that Israel's expansion is ongoing and it's enabled by the United States. If we go all the way back as early as 1948, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff expressed deep concerns about Israel's strategic objectives. They saw that the Zionist strategy wasn't about defense. It was actually about expansion of sovereignty into neighboring countries like Lebanon and Syria. And these weren't baseless, speculations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff understood that, you would read here that they speculated that it would be initial sovereignty over Palestine, acceptance of an unlimited immigration. By the way, both of those are already checked off. And then next would be an expansion. And they had this desire to, what they said, Eretz Israel. So that's Transjordan, parts of Lebanon, Syria. And so this was always understood by the United States. And in the beginning, the United States was very skeptical and actually, somewhat hostile in some ways with some of the expansion plans. I think when we look into it, though, it says that in Truman's era, we find that it says that I was in close contact through David Niles. Ultimately, Truman he made the decision to recognize Israel, but it wasn't based on humanitarian concerns. It was actually after relentless lobbying and pressure by the Zionist leaders like Epstein. The Zionists worked tirelessly behind the scenes, bypassing official channels like State Department to ensure that really their influence reached the highest levels of U.S. leadership. And again, this was a coordinated effort to secure American backing to the Zionist agenda, really kidnapping the United States and ultimately reshaping the political landscape in the Middle East. When we look at Epstein, he was very pivotal in shaping support for Israel, and he was the director of the Jewish Agency, promoted facilitation of Jewish settlements in Palestine, but he was actually also the first Israeli ambassador to the United States. And his influence could not be understated. Interestingly enough, that name Epstein may ring a bell. And it turns out, this is from Times of Israel, by the way, who is confirming that Epstein had a Mossad link. Jeffrey Epstein has links to the Israeli intelligence agency, and it turns out that he did. We know already that his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, her father was a Mossad agent. And so we start to see how all of this huge influence peddling and doing it through blackmail, which was so powerful. Even Truman himself, all the way back, in the late 40s and 50s, he admitted that the level of pressure and political threats he faced from extreme Zionist leaders was really the reason behind giving in, right? This wasn't like diplomatic persuasion. It was like really blackmail at some levels, aiming and ensuring that U.S. recognition of Israel, regardless the consequences of American interest in the region. By 1953, the U.S. intelligence agencies had warned that our close relationship with Israel was causing severe issues in the Middle East. But this group, right, we read here in Walter Hickson's book, Israel's Armor, said the pivotal moment was in 1942 when the historic meeting at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City. And this meeting culminated with the passage of a resolution known as the Biltmore Program that centered around the pledge that Palestine be constituted as a Jewish commonwealth and called for unrestricted Jewish immigration. So we start to see in 42 how this was playing out already. And by 1953, U.S. intelligence agencies were sounding the alarm about these close ties with Israel. We have Dwight Eisenhower, and he said the U.S. association with Israel is a continuing irritant in the U.S.-Arab relations and the major obstacle to the acceptance of U.S. influence in the Middle East. So even with this strong statement, the U.S. kept supporting Israel without much question, and it's because of this strong political ties. David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister, showed that the expansion was always the plan. He said, erect a Jewish state at once, even if it's not the whole land. The rest will come in the course of time. It must come. And this has been the policy since day one. And so it's never been about Israeli defense. It's always been about Israeli expansion. And I really wish people would understand that. That's really why I'm making this video today, is I feel like everyone's saying, oh, wow, Iran is now sending, missile strikes, poor Israel. Not poor Israel. Israel is the bully. Israel is the aggressor. They have always been the aggressor. 1949, we saw again that these, in a top secret memo, we saw that between Etheridge, talking about how Israel says, I'll use the quotes here, while Israel makes no demands upon Lebanon at present, it would like later a portion of southeast Lebanon. We're seeing that literally this week. Israel desires to occupy the Gaza Strip. They've already done that. So Israel's already now, has already destabilized Gaza to the point where they're going to be able to go in. And, it's like they're showing their hand. We already know what's happening. And yet so many are clueless. So many are tied up by this. Again, 1957, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff were greatly concerned at this problem. And they were willing to give some concessions to Israel if they would promise that they wouldn't expand territorial later. But of course, they had every plan to do that. So they would say, okay, sure. But immediately right after, we wouldn't do that. We can even see how people like Feldman, who worked behind the scenes to keep the U.S. policy supportive of Israel, Feldman, although was not officially in the Jewish camp, he was officially in the White House. And he showed how his Zionist interests deeply affected U.S. policies. In fact, Robert Coomer, a U.S. official, explained that while the State and Defense Departments tended to favor Arab nations due to strategic interests like oil, right, the political pressure put on the White House due to support Israel is what really got them. He mentioned that Israel was often seen as a burden strategically, but domestic politics overturned those concerns. He wrote, Israel is a milestone around our necks, millstone. And what's so interesting about that is that we hear, oh, Israel's our best friend. Israel's helping us out. No, Israel has and always will be a burden to the United States. It's a burden against really our involvement in Israel is what's caused, and by the way, also our desire for military, continuing to push the military industrial complex. But it's this idea that we would have had a very different relation with the Middle East, which would have led to us not ultimately making extremists out of many of different Israeli groups, who we call terrorists. By the way, we are the terrorists. Israel is the terrorist. But it's just so interesting how through essentially lobbying, our perspective has changed. Right? We read, our only point of interest with the Israelis and to political interest was argued by somebody else. And so what's interesting is that by 1963, the Justice Department, who was ultimately the Attorney General, right, was Bobby Kennedy. So in this instance, imagine John F. Kennedy is in office. He then asks and says, we've got to make this Zionist council register as a foreign agent, because they're receiving all these funds. And it says the receipt of such funds constitutes a council of a foreign principal. So this is what Bobby Kennedy pushed for. And, immediately they were able to get that done. But what's interesting is while they incorporated this, they still managed to get around even doing this. And so even to this day, they haven't done that. Why? Well, it's pretty interesting what happened next. After this, there was the assassination of both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy a few years later. And so this push to regulate Zionist lobbying lost complete momentum. The American Zionist Council, now called AIPAC, continued to operate without registering as a foreign agent. Right? Israel's influence over U.S. policy grew even stronger, and it even overshadows our own strategic interest at this point. And so I just think it's so interesting how their assassinations led to this. And we see then after the assassination of JFK, his predecessor, which was Lyndon Johnson, he was really very timid in terms of saying anything about Israel. In fact, we see here that while he was frustrated with Israel's lobbying tactics, he allowed them to essentially just run with it. In fact, he even referred Mike Feldman and his prime minister on Israeli matters, right, showing how deeply this Zionist influence had penetrated the government. So again, we're looking here in late 60s now. The U.S. had tried to prevent Israel from developing nuclear weapons, recognizing the danger of this, that this would happen, that if this happened. But they were willing to kind of give this support and give this money if they promised not to go nuclear. The thing is that they already had, right? So what's so crazy about this is that a year before, there was a significant amount of uranium that went missing from a U.S. plant, right? So the Apollo affair was where these Israeli spies ultimately pulled out as much as 600 pounds of highly enriched uranium and brought it over to Israel to create their weapons program. And this instance was called the Apollo affair. And it showed that Israel was not only determined to take what we were willing to offer and give nothing back in terms of guarantees, but they also showed that not only they want to expand territory, they wanted to be a nuclear state, which they are today. One of the, when we really start to look at kind of the mindset of them, a prominent military leader, this Moshe Dayan, right, he later admitted that many of the conflicts with Syria were deliberately provoked by Israel. He would say that they would send these tractors into these demilitarized zones, right? We can actually see what he wrote here. We would send a tractor to plow somewhere, and then knew in advance the Syrians would start to shoot. And if they didn't shoot, we would tell the tractor, just go further, until at the end, the Syrians would get annoyed and shoot. And then we would use artillery and later the Air Force. And so this reveals the mentality of Israel, how all they would do, they would just poke and poke and poke and provoke, right? And so does it sound familiar, right? This tactic of provoking and then retaliating, right? We've seen this repeat in recent conflicts. And, one example of this is how Netanyahu knew months before October 7th that something was going to happen, completely disregarded it because he needed it to happen. Why? So then he could go in, right? He needed it to happen so that he could jump in there. And then what happens? They have a complete genocide. I think we're at 300,000 at this point, of wounded or killed. And then they're already now promoting to extend, and pushing to build settlements now in Gaza. And so, especially in areas where Palestinian homes have been completely destroyed, why do you think they went in and they weren't just there to take out Hamas? Because if they were, they wouldn't have leveled everything. They were there to level everything because they wanted to make sure it was gone so they could rebuild there. This shows this ongoing agenda to expand territory at the expense of Palestinians who are suffering incredible loss. Right? We see how, according to watchdog groups, Israel's already approved the largest land appropriation in the West Bank in 30 years, taking over 12 square miles. So it's at the West Bank, it's in Gaza, and we also see how it's in Lebanon. And so Israel, right, they carry out airstrikes, killing a leader in inside of Lebanon. But then, Hamas does very little back. And so they push further. They say, okay, let's actually shoot rockets into Beirut. And so they actually literally shot rockets into, it's kind of like shooting rockets into like San Francisco or New York or whatever it is. It's like they're literally shooting into a major, in a civilian dense population just to get a reaction. And then they get a little reaction and then they send their ground troops in. And again, we're seeing the same pattern, right? This invasion is a serious escalation, right? But more than that, what we see is coming out of that is there are Israeli settler groups already advertising new properties in southern Lebanon. So the claim that they're trying to bring peace or they're trying to defend themselves, it's not the case. They're literally trying to expand. We're watching the expansion happen in front of our eyes. So what happens? Well, Israel attacks, pokes, and then there has to be some level of retaliation. Otherwise, so Iran has to do something. And whenever it was, a couple months ago, a month ago, whenever it was, a couple months ago now, I guess, Iran, sent this very weak attack. They sent drones, the slowest, to let them know, like, look, hey, we're coming. Like, it was not. They have supersonic missiles. No. They're sending drones. It took hours for them to get there because they had to make some retaliation, but they didn't really want to retaliate, right? And that's what we see again. So just a couple days ago now, we see that Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles. That was because of what they're doing, but there need to be some sort of like, hey, you can't do this anymore. But they're not trying to do any major damage on things. They're ultimately just targeting just the least amount possible, the least amount of military casualties, the least amount of civilian casualties. And then what happens, right? Then, okay, well, the IDF now calls it retaliatory strike. No, you poke, you get poked back, everything's even, call it a day. But if you poke and you get a little teeny poke back and then you punch back, that's not retaliatory. That shows your actual intention. They've been wanting to create an escalated incident in the Middle East for forever. And it's interesting when we start to look at it, how Israel is now starting to be seen for who they are. They're just the spoiled little boy of the world. And how it's just, they have, because they've worked their way through influence peddling, through what we saw with Epstein, through actual blackmail, okay? We've seen how they've worked their way into the U.S. political system, and now they're able to get anything they want. But they're like a spoiled little kid. We can't even stop them at this point. There's a quote, it's beautiful, I think, and this is actually a quote from a while ago. It seems to some observers that for the first time, Israel is on the wrong side of almost every point of issue in the world opinion. Right? And it's just so interesting how after the Holocaust, which, by the way, they were kind of doing the same thing to Germany. I'm not going to get into that. But after the Holocaust, right, they were the golden child. Right? You could not do any, Israel could do no wrong. And now look who they become. Now, again, it's so important to understand that Israel is no longer considered God's people. And it's so interesting how everyone's like, well, we still have to side with Israel because they're God's people. But have you ever read a Bible, like the New Testament anyway? Have you ever read the New Testament? Right? This transition from them being God's people to having close of probation, which, by the way, happened in AD 34, when Stephen was stoned at the end of the 70th week, right? So if you go to Daniel 9:24, it talks about the 70th week of prophecy, right? And at the end of this 70th week was the stoning of Stephen. In 34 AD, the gospel went out to the Gentiles, and God's covenant promises shifted from a literal covenant of the descendants of Abraham to spiritual Israel, and any of those who believe in the name of Christ are now part of spiritual Israel. And so the nation of Israel no longer held a unique covenant, and the message of salvation was extended to everyone. And so when we start to see this idea of Christian Zionism, this is the belief that supports like this idea that somehow the gathering of Israel is a prerequisite to the second coming of Jesus of Christ. This, by the way, first is a complete misunderstanding of who the 144,000 are. That's not of literal Israel. That's of spiritual Israel. That is because, by the way, you couldn't even find the northern 10 tribes of Israel became Samaritans. So you couldn't even gather them together. All that Israel pretends to be is ultimately the lower 2 tribes. But even that, if you trace the lineage of these people, the way they're bringing, anybody can come in and be a settler. There is no Jewish heritage at this point. Anyways, the point simply is that we have been completely blindsided, completely brainwashed through propaganda to somehow believe that Israel is God's still chosen people. And so we really need to be rethinking our support of Israel. And again, this is my 4th video on the topic. I did the first video almost exactly a year ago and I mentioned that they were, planning to, focus on expansion. And I was like, no, that's horrible thinking. They're God's people and they're just there to defend themselves. And now finally, it always comes out at the end. Now we finally see that Israel has no intention of peace. They have no quality of Christ. They have no quality of God. And they are the aggressors. They are the... Yeah, anyways, I'll end the video here. The point simply is, please stop saying ignorant things. Please stop. Go back and actually read the Bible. If you think Israel is somehow God's people still, then you just never actually read the New Testament. You don't understand anything that Paul had to say. And Paul being, by the way, there, previous name Saul, he was there at the stoning of Stephen. And he's the best one to tell us. And he does tell us that it's no longer about the Israelites. They are not part of our Bible prophecy, specifically not in Revelation. If you want to try to tie them to, the northern tribe, that's fine, go for that. But they have no prophecy. There's no relation in Revelation about them. So that's my point.